Snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray New England sky, settling in soft layers across the rooftops of Maplewood, a town that looked as though it had been plucked straight from a Christmas postcard. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name, where the church bell still marked the hours, and where the scent of fresh-baked pies often drifted out from the local diner on Main Street. Life moved slower here, though never without its troubles. But if there was one constant in Maplewood, it was the sight of Eleanor Parker, the quiet widow who lived in the ivy-covered cottage on Willow Lane, knitting by her window each winter. Her cottage sat at the very edge of town, its chimney puffing out smoke that curled like ribbons into the sky. Children passing by on their way to sled down the nearby hill often slowed their steps to peek inside. There she was, like clockwork, rocking gently in her old wooden chair, a basket of colorful yarn at her feet, and needles clicking rhythmically in her weathered hands. It didn't matter if the snowstorm outside was fierce or if the streets were slick with ice, Eleanor was always there, wrapped in a shawl, glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, working on another sweater. To the children, she was something of a mystery. Some whispered silly ghost stories, that the sweaters were magical, or that she knitted them for spirits who roamed the night. Others, bolder and kinder, said she was just a lonely old lady with nothing better to do. Their parents had kinder words, "That's Mrs. Parker. She's been through a lot, but she's got the heart of gold." Still, even the adults didn't really know her story. They only knew the sweaters appeared around town, at church drives, on doorsteps, in hospital donation boxes. No one asked too many questions. In Maplewood, kindness wasn't something you interrogated. It was something you quietly received with gratitude. At the Maplewood Diner, the town's social hub, talk of Eleanor often floated across the booths. Marcia, the diner's owner, would pour coffee and lean on the counter, saying, "That woman must knit faster than machines. I swear, half this town is wrapped up in her yarn." The mailman, Tom, usually grunted in agreement, joking that her knitting must weigh down his bag more than Christmas catalogs. Yet when his wife had fallen ill 2 winters ago, a neatly folded sweater had appeared on their porch, stitched in a shade of green that matched his wife's favorite scarf. Tom never forgot that, and though he teased, he carried a soft respect for the quiet woman. From Eleanor's perspective, the world outside her window was both near and far. She saw the bustle of neighbors shoveling snow, the flash of headlights as families drove home from holiday shopping, the occasional group of children tossing snowballs in the street. She loved watching them, though she rarely joined. Since her husband passed, and her daughter had moved away, she had grown accustomed to silence. Her cottage was filled with small sounds, the kettle whistling, the crackle of the fire, the steady rhythm of needles clacking. Her fingers moved almost without thought, guided by years of practice and something deeper, a purpose known only to her. But she wasn't as invisible as she believed. Each December, people noticed the little details. The pastor at the First Methodist Church saw how Eleanor always delivered her bundles anonymously, slipping them into the donation pile when no one was looking. The nurses at St. Mary's Hospital recognized her neat stitching, familiar from the blankets they used in the children's wing. A few of the younger mothers in town, grateful for the sweaters left on their porches during especially hard winters, whispered about her in hushed tones at the grocery store, "She must know what we're going through." The contrast between her solitude and the life of the town grew sharper as the holidays approached. While Maplewood's main street lit up with string lights and shopkeepers decorated their windows with painted snowflakes, Eleanor's cottage remained simple, undecorated except for the evergreen wreath that had hung on her door for years. She wasn't cold or unkind, but she preferred to give quietly, without fanfare. The town sang carols, held Christmas pageants, and filled the square with laughter. Eleanor watched, smiled faintly, and returned to her chair. Yet, beneath the quiet surface, her knitting carried weight. Every stitch, every row was threaded with something unspoken. Though the townspeople couldn't see it, her mind wasn't only focused on the yarn. Memories wove themselves into the fabric, a childhood winter spent huddled by a single stove during the Depression, her late husband's laughter echoing through the house, the scent of her daughter's hair when she was little. The sweaters weren't just garments, they were stories, grief, love, and remembrance, all hidden in wool. One evening, as snow fell heavier than usual, a group of teenagers trudged up the hill past her cottage. They laughed and shouted, red-faced from the cold, their voices carrying through the crisp air. One of them slowed, pointing toward Eleanor's window. "There she is. Always knitting. My mom says she's been doing that since before I was born." Another shrugged, tossing a snowball. "Kinda creepy, if you ask me." But the smallest of the group, a girl with pink mittens, lingered. "My grandma says Mrs. Parker gave her a sweater when my grandpa died. Said it was the warmest thing she'd ever worn. I think she's nice." The others didn't respond. They kept walking, their laughter fading. But the little girl glanced back one last time, as if sensing something the others didn't. Inside, Eleanor didn't hear their voices, but she would have smiled if she had. She wasn't knitting for recognition. She was knitting because it was the only way she knew to keep love alive in a world that often felt too cold. As the chapter of winter unfolded, so did the mystery. By the time Christmas lights twinkled across Maplewood and families gathered for celebrations, Eleanor had already completed more than 24 sweaters. Some were tucked neatly into boxes, ready to be delivered. Others sat folded by the door, destined for someone who needed them, though no one yet knew who that would be. The sight of the elderly woman, framed by a frosted window and surrounded by colorful yarn, became part of the season itself. Just as predictably as the snowfall or the church choir, Eleanor Parker knitting sweaters was Maplewood's quiet winter tradition. A tradition that, for now, no one truly understood. But the truth, the reason behind the sweaters, the history carried in each thread, was waiting. And when the town would finally discover it, their lives would never be the same. The first rays of a pale winter sun stretched across Maplewood's main street, where icicles hung like glass ornaments from the eaves of shops. The small town had its quirks, but what made it beautiful wasn't the architecture or the landscape. It was the people. They knew each other's histories, remembered each other's losses, and celebrated each other's triumphs, no matter how small. In Maplewood, community wasn't just a word, it was a lifeline. The Maplewood Diner, painted in cheerful red and white stripes, was its beating heart. The bell above the door jingled as townsfolk filtered in, farmers coming in from the outskirts, high school kids grabbing hot chocolate before class, and elderly couples seeking warmth over steaming coffee. Marcia Reynolds, the diner's owner, was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and an ever-present apron dusted with flour. Her diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was where stories were exchanged, advice was given freely, and comfort was found in both food and company. On this particular morning, Marcia poured steaming coffee into Tom Miller's cup, the town's mailman for nearly 3 decades. Tom wore his postal cap pulled low, his cheeks ruddy from the biting air. He leaned on the counter, rubbing his hands together. "You know," Tom said, blowing on his coffee, "that Parker woman is at it again. Dropped off 2 big bags at the church drive yesterday. Nearly threw out my back carrying them inside." Marcia chuckled, wiping the counter. "Well, at least you got some free exercise out of it. Lord knows Eleanor's sweaters have probably kept half this town from freezing." A young nurse, Emily Carter, seated at a booth nearby, looked up from her plate of scrambled eggs. She knitted blankets for the children's ward last year. Bright colors, too. Not those dull grays you get from the store. You should have seen the kids' faces. They carried them like treasure. Her voice softened. "I don't think she knows what it meant." Tom shrugged, trying to mask the warmth behind his gruffness. "Strange old lady, though. Never comes to town unless it's church or groceries. Always by that window, knitting away. Like she's waiting for something, or someone." The diner grew quiet for a moment, the clinking of dishes filling the silence. The townsfolk weren't cruel, they admired Eleanor in their own way. But there was something about her that drew curiosity. She was part of Maplewood, yet somehow apart from it, like a note in a song that lingered longer than the rest. Across town, at the First Methodist Church, Reverend Daniels was preparing for the weekly food drive. He was a tall man with a gentle voice, beloved by children for his patience and by adults for his wisdom. He remembered vividly how Eleanor had slipped in the night before, carrying 2 large bags of sweaters. She hadn't said a word, just placed them on the steps and given him a nod. "She reminds me of the widow in Scripture," Reverend Daniels later told his wife. "Quiet in her giving, never seeking recognition. I think she believes kindness should whisper, not shout." Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, the staff were all too familiar with Eleanor's work. The pediatric wing was often filled with children from struggling families, many arriving without proper winter clothing. Each December, a box marked "Donations" would appear, stuffed with hand-knit sweaters and mittens. The nurses began recognizing Eleanor's work by the intricate patterns, tiny stars woven into sleeves, hearts along the hems. The hospital staff never officially asked if it was her, but they knew. In homes across Maplewood, Eleanor's knitting was woven into stories of resilience. On the east side of town, a young single mother named Rachel found a small package on her porch during the hardest winter of her life. Inside was a sweater, knitted in a rich blue yarn. She remembered pulling it over her son's thin shoulders, watching him smile for the first time in weeks. She never told anyone, but she cried that night, clutching the sweater to her chest as though it were a lifeline. And on the outskirts, old Mr. Whitaker, who lived alone after his wife's passing, had been given a thick, brown sweater one December. He wore it every day during the cold months. Neighbors often saw him sitting on his porch, wrapped in the sweater, whispering to his late wife as if she were still beside him. These stories never reached Eleanor directly. People didn't come knocking to say thank you. And perhaps that was how she preferred it. For the townsfolk, her sweaters weren't just clothing. They were quiet reminders that someone saw their struggles, even when no one else did. Yet, despite the gratitude, curiosity persisted. Why did she knit so much? Why every winter? Why, even at her age, did she pour herself into this work without pause? Some said it was simply what lonely widows did, keeping their hands busy to silence the ache of empty houses. Others thought maybe she was trying to leave a mark, something that would outlast her. But the most popular theory, whispered around coffee tables and at PTA meetings, was that Eleanor had a secret reason, something painful she never spoke about. The sweaters weren't random acts of charity. They were part of a story, one that hadn't yet been told. Back at the diner, Marcia refilled cups and shifted the conversation. Whatever her reasons, I'll say this, Eleanor Parker might be the quietest person in town, but she's also the most present. You don't notice her until you need her. And when you need her, she's already there. The words lingered, and everyone nodded silently. Maplewood was the kind of place where small gestures became legends, where kindness carried weight far greater than money. In a world that often felt too rushed, too fractured, the people of Maplewood found comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere, was watching over them in her own quiet way. From the outside, Maplewood looked ordinary, a small town with brick storefronts, a church spire, and homes with snow-covered lawns. But underneath, it was stitched together by invisible threads, threads of kindness, grief, love, and resilience. And whether they realized it or not, Eleanor Parker had been weaving those threads into their lives for decades. As the day faded and the lights along Main Street blinked to life, Eleanor sat once more in her rocking chair. From her window, she could see the faint glow of the diner's neon sign and hear the distant toll of the church bell. Her hands moved steadily, pulling soft blue yarn through her needles. Another sweater was taking shape, another story waiting to be told. The town bustled outside, people laughing, cars passing, children tugging sleds behind them. They carried on, unaware that every stitch Eleanor made carried a piece of her heart. They didn't yet know how deeply she had already changed them, how much her silent devotion had already become the unseen heartbeat of their town. They would. And when they did, Maplewood would never be the same again. Winter in Maplewood was beautiful, but it was also a time for reflection. While the townsfolk bustled about, preparing for holidays and daily life, Eleanor Parker often found herself adrift in memory. Her cottage, cozy and warm with the fire crackling in the hearth, seemed almost suspended in time, a quiet sanctuary from the world outside. She sat in her rocking chair, the basket of yarn at her feet, needles moving rhythmically, but her mind wandered far from the sweaters in progress. It was impossible for Eleanor to think about winter without remembering her late husband, Henry Parker. He had been a factory worker, a man whose hands were rough from decades of labor but whose heart was tender beyond words. Henry had loved the simplest things, long walks through the snow, Sunday breakfasts at the diner, and Eleanor's knitting, which he never fully understood but always admired. Their love had been steady, a quiet kind of devotion that filled the spaces between words with warmth. Eleanor recalled a Christmas decades ago, when their young daughter Clara was just 6 years old. The house had been small, modest, yet alive with laughter. Eleanor had spent weeks knitting a tiny sweater for Clara, a bright yellow with little red stars, and had stayed up late finishing it by the fire. Henry had sat beside her, sipping cocoa, teasing her about how no child could ever be that patient waiting for a sweater. But Clara had rushed down the stairs that morning, eyes wide, and hugged the sweater to her chest as though it were magic. That was the day Eleanor realized how her hands could create more than warmth, they could carry love. Yet life, in its relentless passage, had a way of testing hearts. Henry fell ill when Clara was in high school, a sudden illness that left Eleanor managing the household alone while trying to support her grieving daughter. She worked double shifts at a local fabric shop, stitched together meals, and continued her knitting, though the patterns grew darker, more introspective. Every sweater she made during those years carried unspoken grief, woven into the fabric in subtle shades of navy, gray, and deep crimson. The hardest blow came when Clara left Maplewood for New York. She had been ambitious, driven, and full of dreams that outgrew their small town. Eleanor had understood, at least in part, but the ache of separation was profound. Letters came sporadically at first, handwritten notes filled with details of city life, new friends, and budding career opportunities. Eleanor cherished them, storing each in a box under her bed. But over time, the letters became infrequent. Calls were short. The distance was no longer measured in miles but in silence, a quiet wall that neither knew how to scale. Eleanor often replayed the conversations in her mind, moments when she had tried to bridge the gap. "Clara," she had said one Christmas, voice trembling, "remember, you can always come home. No matter what." And Clara had smiled, polite but distracted, a hint of guilt in her eyes before returning to her phone. That smile had haunted Eleanor for years, a reminder of love stretched thin by life's demands. In her quiet moments, Eleanor imagined the life she had hoped for Clara, a future full of warmth, stability, and love. And yet, she understood that happiness often required sacrifice. She hadn't wanted to hold Clara back. She had wanted her to soar, even if it meant enduring loneliness herself. That's why the sweaters became more than blankets, they became a bridge. A silent promise that no matter how far people drifted, someone cared enough to keep them warm, to keep them remembered. It wasn't just Clara she mourned silently. Henry's absence left a hollow space in her life that no one could fill. The holidays were especially hard. Tree decorations and homemade treats served as bittersweet reminders of a family that had once been complete. She remembered sitting alone on Christmas Eve, knitting by the fire, a cup of cocoa cooling beside her. The shadows on the walls whispered memories of laughter, of arguments resolved with patience, of love so ordinary that it became extraordinary simply by enduring. Her grief, however, didn't harden her heart. Instead, it softened it, widening it to encompass not just her family but the lives of those around her. She began to notice small details in her neighbors' lives, the anxious glance of a mother trying to manage 3 kids in the cold, the shivering delivery boy with numb fingers, the elderly widower clutching a worn coat for warmth. Every stitch she knitted carried empathy born from her own loss. Every sweater became a quiet statement, "I see you. I care. You are not alone." And yet, the ache of estrangement from Clara never fully left her. She found herself holding the letters from decades ago, tracing Clara's handwriting with trembling fingers. Each word was a reminder of both hope and heartache. Some nights, she allowed herself to imagine the two of them sitting together by the fire, Clara's head resting on her shoulder, hands intertwined as they knitted together. But in the morning, reality returned with its soft, relentless weight. The cottage was quiet, save for the clicking of her needles and the faint hiss of the fire. Despite the silence, Eleanor clung to a quiet optimism. She believed in the resilience of family bonds, even when frayed by time and distance. She believed that love could be expressed in small, consistent acts, like knitting a sweater on a bitterly cold night, or leaving it anonymously on someone's doorstep. Each stitch was a message, a thread connecting her past, her losses, and her hopes for the future. Even Maplewood, with its bustling streets and cozy diners, became a backdrop to Eleanor's quiet devotion. The townsfolk didn't know her full story, they only saw the results. A sweater for a struggling child, a blanket for a widowed neighbor, a carefully knitted scarf for someone in need. But each item carried decades of memory, Henry's laughter, Clara's first smile, holidays filled with joy and sorrow alike. Each thread was infused with the essence of a life lived fully, deeply, and compassionately. One evening, Eleanor paused her knitting and looked out the window at the snow-covered town. A single thought drifted through her mind: I will keep going. Not for recognition, not for praise. But because warmth is something the world always needs. She knew that the sweaters were more than garments, they were a testament to love's endurance, a message to her daughter, and a quiet legacy for anyone willing to receive it. Her fingers resumed their work, weaving vibrant reds, gentle blues, and soft greens. She imagined Clara opening a package one day, long after the snowy nights of her childhood, and feeling the love stitched into every row. She imagined her daughter understanding, perhaps for the first time, why her mother had spent decades in solitude, dedicating herself to the town and to the silent hope that her love could ripple outward, touching lives she might never even meet. And so, Eleanor Parker continued her vigil at the window, knitting by firelight, the shadows of past and present entwined in every stitch. In the quiet, she built not just sweaters, but bridges, between herself and a daughter far away, between grief and hope, between isolation and connection. The town went about its daily life, unaware of the depth of emotion contained in each bundle of yarn, each carefully crafted stitch, and the story that would, one day, move them to tears. The wind howled through Maplewood that evening, rattling shutters and sending snowflakes swirling across the streets like tiny dancers. Eleanor Parker, tucked into her rocking chair by the window, barely noticed. She had spent the day knitting a deep green sweater, her fingers moving automatically as her mind wandered among memories of past winters and the people she had silently helped. The glow from the fire illuminated her gentle face, the soft lines of age softened further by the lamplight. A knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour, and certainly not in the biting cold. Peering through the frosted glass, she saw a boy, no older than 16, shivering in an oversized jacket with holes at the elbows and thin gloves that left his fingers red and stiff. His eyes were wide, a mixture of fear and determination, and his breath formed little clouds in the frigid air. Eleanor rose slowly, adjusting her shawl. She opened the door just enough to ask, "Can I help you, young man?" The boy hesitated, teeth chattering. I don't have a coat," he admitted, voice barely audible over the gusts of wind. "And the bus, it left me at the edge of town." Eleanor's heart clenched. She could see the pale tips of his fingers and the redness on his cheeks. Without hesitation, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Warm yourself by the fire. You'll catch your death out there." The boy's name, he later told her, was Ethan, and he lived on the outskirts of town with his single mother. Their home was small, heated by a single old furnace, and the winter had been particularly harsh. Money was tight, groceries and heating bills left little for clothing or warmth. Tonight, he had been trying to get to a friend's house but had misjudged the distance, arriving exhausted and freezing at Eleanor's doorstep. Inside, the cottage was a haven. The scent of burning wood and pine filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of lavender from a small sachet on the mantel. Eleanor fetched a blanket from the couch and draped it around his shoulders. "Sit," she said gently. "I'll make some cocoa while you warm up." Ethan's eyes wandered around the room, taking in the yarn scattered across the table, the half-finished sweater in her lap, and the small stack of folded garments resting neatly on a side chair. You made all these?" he asked, voice tinged with awe. Eleanor nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "Yes. They're for people who need a little warmth. Some who don't have enough." Ethan's gaze fell to the green sweater she had just finished. Could I have one?" he asked quietly, almost afraid to speak the wish aloud. Eleanor's eyes softened. She stood and held the sweater out to him. "It's yours. You need it more than anyone I know tonight." As he slipped it on, the sleeves a little long but comforting nonetheless, Ethan felt warmth seep into his body, not just from the sweater, but from the quiet, nurturing presence of this stranger. For the first time that evening, he felt safe, seen, and, most unexpectedly, cared for. "Why do you do this?" Ethan asked, curiosity breaking through his initial shyness. "Knitting all these sweaters for people you don't even know?" Eleanor paused, her hands resting on her knitting. She looked at the boy, searching his young eyes for understanding. "Because sometimes, people need to know someone cares," she said simply. "It doesn't have to be a big thing. Sometimes warmth, a little comfort, it's enough to help them through the hardest days." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He had grown up seeing his mother struggle, the constant tension of bills and sickness pressing down on their small family. But here was Eleanor, a grandmotherly figure who had chosen to dedicate her winters to others' comfort. It was almost unbelievable to him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself returning to Eleanor's cottage. Sometimes to help carry groceries, sometimes to fetch firewood, and sometimes just to sit and watch her knit. He learned the rhythm of her needles, the gentle way she selected colors, the careful precision of her patterns. He watched her laugh at small, private jokes and sometimes catch tears she thought no one could see. Through these moments, a bond formed. Eleanor became a surrogate grandmother, guiding him through the challenges of adolescence with patience, humor, and quiet wisdom. She never scolded harshly, she merely shared stories of her own youth, lessons learned in hardship, and the importance of seeing kindness in everyday life. One afternoon, as snow blanketed Maplewood in a serene silence, Ethan confessed something he had kept hidden. "Sometimes I feel invisible," he admitted. "At school, with my mom at home, like no one notices me until I mess up. But when I'm here, it feels different. Like I matter." Eleanor set down her needles, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You do matter, Ethan. Every person matters, even when the world doesn't see it. That's why we care for others quietly, without expecting praise. Because every act of kindness is a ripple in a much larger river." Ethan smiled faintly, the first genuine warmth of hope in weeks. Do you ever get lonely?" he asked. Her gaze softened, and she nodded. "Yes. But loneliness doesn't mean the world is empty. It means we learn how to fill it with love, with action, with care for those around us." She gestured to the sweaters surrounding them. "And sometimes, filling the world with warmth is as simple as a stitch at a time." As winter deepened, Ethan began noticing how Eleanor's sweaters arrived at unexpected places throughout Maplewood. He saw families on the street proudly carrying them, and neighbors whispering stories about anonymous gifts that had lifted their spirits. "It's like she knows," he said one day, staring at a row of freshly knitted garments ready to be delivered. "Like she sees who needs them before anyone else does." Eleanor smiled quietly. "Perhaps. Or maybe I just pay attention." Through their time together, the boy began to understand the silent power of generosity. He realized that love didn't always come with words or applause. Sometimes, it came in warmth that could be worn, held, or remembered in a single comforting gesture. And he wanted to be part of it, not because of recognition, but because it made the world a better place, one small act at a time. By the end of the winter, the bond between Eleanor and Ethan had transformed both their lives. He had found a safe harbor, someone who believed in him without judgment, who nurtured his confidence, and who showed him the meaning of quiet heroism. She had found a companion who helped bridge the silence of her later years, someone who reminded her of the joy in shared connection and the vitality that comes from mentoring the next generation. One particularly cold evening, Ethan lingered on the porch before heading home. "I'll see you tomorrow," he asked, brushing snow from his coat. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll be here. And I'll be knitting." As he trudged through the snow, the green sweater hugging him close, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't known for months. In the quiet of her cottage, Eleanor resumed her knitting, her heart lighter for the first time in years. And somewhere in the rhythmic click of the needles, the town's next chapter of warmth, hope, and unseen kindness was already beginning. Ethan didn't know it yet, but he had become part of Eleanor's story, a story of love stitched quietly into every fiber, of a community slowly learning the value of silent devotion, and of a winter that would forever mark the start of something extraordinary. Winter in Maplewood had a rhythm all its own. The streets were blanketed in snow, footsteps leaving fleeting imprints, and smoke curled from chimneys like signals of warmth and life. Yet beneath the picturesque surface, the town felt the quiet hum of Eleanor Parker's work, stitched invisibly into the fabric of their daily lives. Her sweaters, carried by mailmen, hidden in donation boxes, or placed discreetly on porches, began to ripple through the community in ways no one could have anticipated. It started small. Mrs. Donovan, a widow who lived 2 blocks from the church, discovered a soft lavender sweater hanging on her fence one morning. At first, she thought it was left by mistake. But as she held it against her chest, the chill of winter faded, replaced by a warmth that seemed to seep deeper than her skin. She whispered a prayer, thinking of her late husband and how she hadn't felt cared for in years. It was more than clothing, it was a gesture of love, quiet but unmistakable. Across town, young parents like Rachel and her son, Micah, noticed similar miracles. Micah had been grumbling about the cold during the morning walk to school when Rachel discovered a neatly folded sweater in their mailbox. Its colors, a cheerful mix of red and gold, made him giggle despite the biting wind. That evening, as Micah curled up on the couch, Rachel realized the sweater had done more than warm him physically, it had restored a sense of wonder and safety in a world that often felt too hard. The Maplewood Diner became the hub for hushed conversations about Eleanor's mysterious generosity. Regulars speculated, each story carrying a layer of hope or curiosity. "Did you see those mittens at the hospital?" one mother whispered to another, "and the scarf Mrs. Whitaker got last week? I think she's making the town warmer in ways we don't even understand." Tom, the mailman, chuckled but felt a lump in his throat. "I've been delivering mail here for 30 years, he said softly, "and I've never seen anything like this. No bills, no letters, just kindness." Even teenagers who had once made fun of the old knitting lady started to notice. Ethan, inspired by Eleanor's work, shared small lessons with his friends. "It's not just about sweaters," he explained one afternoon, holding a bright blue garment he had helped fold. "It's about caring. About seeing someone who might be invisible and letting them know they're not." Some scoffed initially, but slowly, curiosity and admiration replaced skepticism. In the hospital's pediatric wing, the staff began to notice a subtle shift. Children who received Eleanor's sweaters smiled brighter, spoke more freely, and clutched their gifts as if they held magical power. Nurses reported that the hospital felt warmer, less clinical, more human. Emily Carter, the nurse who had first marveled at Eleanor's work, observed quietly, "It's like the sweaters carry more than warmth. They carry hope." As the weeks passed, Eleanor's impact spread beyond immediate recipients. Community leaders and schoolteachers began to hear the whispers of gratitude. Parents talked about children sharing stories of an anonymous benefactor who seemed to know exactly what they needed. School counselors noticed increased confidence among students who had received small gestures of warmth. The town's small acts of kindness, amplified by Eleanor's quiet devotion, began to create a subtle but profound cultural shift. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her work undeterred. Each morning, she selected yarn with care, choosing colors that matched the personalities she imagined for the recipients. She sometimes imagined the children laughing, the mothers sighing in relief, the elderly men and women feeling seen and valued. Every stitch was deliberate, every pattern a message of care. Ethan became her constant companion in this endeavor. They would sort yarn, fold finished garments, and plan discreet deliveries. In the process, he learned lessons that went far beyond the practical, lessons about empathy, humility, and the ripple effect of giving without expectation. One afternoon, as they prepared a stack of sweaters for the hospital, Ethan remarked, "Do you think they know it's you?" Eleanor shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "No. That's the point. We give because it matters, not for recognition." Yet, even in anonymity, the town's collective awareness of Eleanor's kindness grew. A subtle sense of gratitude, almost imperceptible at first, took root. People began helping each other more spontaneously, neighbors shoveling driveways without being asked, children sharing lunches at school, and parents quietly assisting other families struggling with bills or illness. Eleanor's quiet devotion became a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the latent compassion in every resident of Maplewood. One evening, as the town gathered for the annual holiday tree lighting, her sweaters became a symbol of community warmth. Volunteers noticed that children wore the garments Eleanor had knitted, their bright colors and intricate patterns visible against the snow. Parents, teachers, and even the mayor marveled at the way these small, seemingly inconsequential gifts had woven a tapestry of connection across the town. Some whispered in awe, others silently thanked the mysterious benefactor, and all felt the subtle shift toward unity, empathy, and care. At the same time, Eleanor faced her own quiet battles. Her hands sometimes ached from hours of knitting, and fatigue gnawed at her bones. Yet she persevered, driven not by obligation but by love. She understood that warmth wasn't only physical, it was emotional, a shield against loneliness, despair, and the harshness of life. Each sweater she delivered, each gift she left on a doorstep, was a reminder that compassion could be tangible. Ethan observed her with growing admiration. One snowy afternoon, as they prepared another round of sweaters for families in need, he asked, "How do you keep going? Even when it's hard?" Eleanor paused, her gaze distant yet tender. "Because the world needs it," she replied. "Because someone's life can be changed in the smallest way by a single act of care. And because one day, someone might do the same for you, or someone you love." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, understanding more than he could express. He began noticing his own capacity for kindness, inspired by Eleanor's unwavering dedication. He started helping classmates quietly, offering small gestures of empathy, learning firsthand how one person's consistent care could create a ripple effect far greater than imagined. By the end of the season, Maplewood had subtly transformed. Streets felt warmer, not because the temperatures had risen, but because hearts had. People spoke to strangers with more patience, helped neighbors without hesitation, and smiled with deeper sincerity. The town, once quietly resilient, had become quietly extraordinary, all sparked by the steady, unseen labor of one woman and the boy who had learned to walk beside her. On a particularly still evening, Eleanor and Ethan walked the snowy streets together, delivering a final batch of sweaters to families on the outskirts of town. The snow reflected the lamplight, creating halos around their feet, as if the universe itself acknowledged the ripple of good their actions had generated. They didn't speak much, yet the silence between them was warm, full of understanding, trust, and the unspoken knowledge that kindness, even in its smallest form, could reshape lives. In the quiet of her cottage later that night, Eleanor sat back in her rocking chair, fingers lightly resting on a half-finished sweater. She looked out the window at the town bathed in moonlight, feeling an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction. The sweaters had done more than warm bodies, they had knit a community together, reminding everyone that even in the harshest winter, warmth could be found in human connection. Eleanor smiled softly to herself. She didn't need accolades, nor recognition, nor acknowledgement. The knowledge that lives had been touched, that hope had been rekindled, and that hearts had been quietly healed, was enough. Maplewood, unknowingly, had begun to understand a profound truth, that generosity doesn't always announce itself, that acts of love can be invisible yet transformative, and that one person's dedication to kindness could echo across an entire community. And somewhere, in the heart of it all, Eleanor Parker continued her work, her needles clicking like a metronome of hope, her hands weaving not just sweaters but threads of compassion that would endure long after the snow had melted. The first whispers began innocuously. A mother at the grocery store noticed a familiar pattern on a sweater her daughter wore. A neighbor at the gas station remarked on the delicate stitching of mittens found in her mailbox. And slowly, Maplewood began to notice a strange consistency in the quiet generosity that had touched so many lives. At the heart of these observations was Eleanor Parker, the elderly woman whose name was rarely spoken but whose presence was profoundly felt. The townsfolk had long admired her, if only from a distance. Her sweaters, scarves, and mittens had become staples of winter, leaving a trail of warmth and gratitude behind. But as the stories multiplied, curiosity grew. Who was she, really? Why did she dedicate herself so quietly, so consistently, to strangers and neighbors alike? The Maplewood Gazette, the small-town newspaper with more heart than circulation, caught wind of the murmurs. Reporter Clara Benson, herself a lifelong resident with a fascination for the quiet heroes of town, decided to investigate. She began with small interviews, neighbors, school staff, parents, and children. Each story painted a picture of Eleanor as selfless, gentle, and almost magical in her timing. A child sick with flu would find a sweater on their doorstep. A struggling mother would discover mittens neatly folded in her mailbox. The pattern was undeniable. Clara decided to pay Eleanor a visit, ostensibly to write a human interest piece. When she knocked, Eleanor answered with her usual warm smile, knitting needles poised, yarn spilling gently across the table. "Mrs. Parker," Clara began, voice tinged with nervous excitement, "I wanted to understand your work. Why do you do it?" Eleanor paused, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of memories. "Because someone needs it," she said simply. "Because warmth can mean more than comfort. It can mean hope." Clara pressed further, gently, "There's a story here, isn't there? Something more than sweaters." Eleanor sighed, setting her knitting aside. She gestured for Clara to sit. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Finally, she spoke, her voice a mixture of vulnerability and strength. "Many years ago," she began, "I had a family. A husband, Henry, and a daughter, Clara. We were happy in our own quiet way. But life has a way of taking what you cherish most. Henry became ill, and I was left to care for both him and our daughter alone. The winters were the hardest, not because of the cold, but because of the fear that my family would suffer without help. I knit for my daughter to keep her warm, to comfort her when I couldn't do anything else. And when Henry passed, and later, when my daughter grew up and left, I realized that the act of knitting had given me a purpose, a way to keep love alive, even when it was invisible." Clara Benson listened, captivated. She had expected anecdotes, perhaps quaint recollections of small-town generosity. She hadn't expected raw, palpable grief and devotion intertwined in every word. Eleanor continued. "I never sought recognition. I never wanted people to feel obligated. I just wanted to ensure that no one ever felt as alone as I had at those cold, dark times. Every stitch is a memory, a message, a hope. And when I see a child smile, or a mother sigh with relief, I know that love, in its quietest form, has reached them." The room was heavy with emotion. Clara, tears welling, understood now why the sweaters had touched so many lives. They weren't just acts of charity, they were living extensions of Eleanor's heart, stitched with grief, hope, and enduring love. As word spread through the town, curiosity turned to admiration, and admiration into communal empathy. Neighbors who had once only nodded in passing began to reach out, seeking to connect, to understand, to offer small gestures in return. Maplewood, already warm in spirit, began to feel almost sacred in its quiet human connections. At the Maplewood Elementary School, teachers started noticing the effect on children who had received Eleanor's gifts. Students were more engaged, more confident, and more generous toward their peers. Emily Carter, the nurse, observed that the pediatric ward had become a place not only of healing but of laughter, courage, and hope, all catalyzed by the unseen work of one woman. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to witness Eleanor's impact firsthand. He had helped deliver hundreds of sweaters by now, and the town's gradual realization of her story only deepened his respect. He began to see the layers of human connection that Eleanor had quietly woven, a mother no longer lonely, a child feeling valued, a struggling neighbor reassured that someone cared. One snowy afternoon, the mayor invited Eleanor to a community event. At first, she hesitated. She had never sought recognition, never wanted to be in the spotlight. But the town insisted, gathering to honor the woman who had become an invisible lifeline of kindness. Children she had never formally met held up banners, neighbors offered warm handshakes, and families smiled with gratitude. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for the love that had silently connected them all. At the same time, Clara Benson's article hit the Maplewood Gazette, detailing Eleanor's decades-long devotion. The story resonated far beyond the town's borders, shared on social media and picked up by larger news outlets. Commenters from across the country expressed awe at Eleanor's selflessness, many moved to tears. Her work, once quiet and unnoticed outside Maplewood, had become a beacon of hope for strangers she would never meet. Yet, the most profound reactions were within the town itself. Maplewood residents began looking at one another differently, noticing small acts of generosity they had previously overlooked. A sense of empathy grew, and the community quietly but steadily transformed. Eleanor had sparked not just warmth through her sweaters, but a cultural shift, reminder that compassion could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that often remained unseen but were deeply felt. In the following weeks, Eleanor's cottage became a small hub for communal support. Neighbors visited not for recognition, but for guidance, advice, and the shared comfort of being part of something larger than themselves. Ethan assisted her, now fully aware of the profound significance of their work. Together, they embodied a living lesson, that love and kindness, when consistent and genuine, could transcend age, circumstance, and distance. Even as the snow melted, the emotional resonance of Eleanor's work remained. Families continued to speak of the gifts, sharing stories of warmth, care, and hope. The town had discovered the reason behind the mysterious generosity, and with it came a collective appreciation for the unseen hero who had, through quiet devotion, touched their lives profoundly. Eleanor herself remained humble, continuing to knit and deliver without expectation. But now, when she walked through town, people greeted her not only with polite nods but with heartfelt smiles, gestures of gratitude, and a recognition of the depth of her humanity. The mystery had unfolded, revealing a story not of fame or recognition, but of enduring love, grief transformed into purpose, and the profound power of small, consistent acts of kindness. And so, the town of Maplewood learned a lesson it would never forget, that true heroism often whispers, that the heart can heal through action, and that love, no matter how quietly expressed, can change the world, one stitch, one gesture, and one soul at a time. Spring had not yet arrived in Maplewood, but the chill in the air no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it carried a sense of renewal, a whisper of transformation. The town, once quietly enduring its winters, had begun to awaken, not because of the thawing snow, but because of the warmth Eleanor Parker had instilled in every heart she touched. It began subtly. Families who had received her sweaters began leaving notes of thanks on porches for others to find. Children knitted small scarves for classmates, inspired by the mysterious generosity they had witnessed. Even teenagers, who had once scoffed at the old lady with her yarn, began to ask Eleanor for guidance on how to contribute in meaningful ways. Maplewood was beginning to understand that kindness, when contagious, could shape a community. Eleanor, ever modest, continued her work in her quiet cottage. Her windows glowed at night with the familiar light of the fire, and the rhythmic clicking of her needles became a comforting soundtrack for the neighborhood. But now, she noticed the world outside responding, neighbors shoveling snow for one another, sharing groceries, and leaving small tokens of care without expectation of recognition. It was as though her simple acts had sparked a chain reaction, a town-wide embrace of empathy. Ethan, who had grown from a shy, uncertain boy into a confident, thoughtful young man, walked beside her one afternoon, carrying a stack of freshly knitted sweaters. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice tinged with excitement, "look at this. The Thompsons left cocoa for the kids at school, and the Millers are donating blankets to families in need. Your work, it's everywhere." Eleanor's eyes softened. "It's not just my work, Ethan. It's the kindness we inspire in others that matters. That's where true warmth comes from." At the Maplewood Elementary School, teachers noticed a remarkable change. Students were more collaborative, more empathetic, and more willing to share. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Jensen, remarked, "It's as though a veil has been lifted. The children are learning to care for one another in ways I haven't seen before." Even the smallest acts, a shared pencil, a comforting hand, a helping smile, were multiplied, echoing Eleanor's silent message, that generosity and empathy could ripple outward, transforming lives beyond expectation. The town's commercial center also reflected this awakening. At the diner, customers began paying for strangers' meals. Local businesses donated coats and gloves anonymously, inspired by the mysterious legacy Eleanor had created. Conversations shifted from complaints about the cold to discussions of what they could do to help their neighbors. Maplewood, once quietly enduring winter, was now a community alive with intentional acts of love. Eleanor and Ethan made it a point to visit families who had been most touched by her sweaters. One afternoon, they delivered a set of hand-knit mittens to Mrs. Donovan, who had become a quiet mentor for younger neighbors. She clasped Eleanor's hands, tears welling. "You've shown us what it means to care without expecting anything," she said. "I don't know how to thank you, but I promise to pay it forward." Paying it forward became the town's unwritten motto. Children delivered baked goods to elderly neighbors. Teenagers tutored younger students without being asked. Families offered rides, shared groceries, and created small acts of warmth in ways that mirrored Eleanor's quiet devotion. The town had embraced her philosophy, that love and kindness were not just actions but legacies that could endure long after the initial gesture. One evening, the town gathered for a community bonfire, a new tradition inspired by Eleanor's impact. People brought handmade gifts, warm food, and blankets, forming a circle that symbolized unity. Eleanor, seated by the fire with Ethan at her side, watched the faces around her glow with gratitude, joy, and connection. She realized that what had started as a solitary act of love had grown into a communal movement, a testament to the resilience of human hearts when guided by empathy. Mayor Thompson took the stage, his voice filled with emotion. "Tonight, we honor someone who has taught us the true meaning of community. Someone who has shown us that even the smallest act of kindness can ignite change. Eleanor Parker, your generosity has transformed Maplewood, and for that, we are forever grateful." Eleanor, usually reserved and modest, felt tears prick her eyes. She stood, glancing at Ethan, the children, and the townsfolk whose lives had been touched. "I never did this for recognition," she said softly, her voice carrying through the night air. "I did it because every person deserves to feel warmth, love, and hope. If my actions inspired you to share kindness, then the work continues, and that is more than I could ever hope for." Ethan squeezed her hand, a silent affirmation of their shared journey. "You've done more than knit sweaters," he whispered. "You've knitted us all together." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, a collective expression of gratitude and understanding. Children waved handmade scarves, teenagers presented gifts they had crafted themselves, and families exchanged smiles that conveyed deep emotional resonance. Maplewood, in that moment, understood the profound truth, that love, generosity, and empathy could be taught, shared, and multiplied, creating a legacy far greater than anyone could imagine. As the bonfire crackled, Eleanor looked at the flickering flames and remembered her daughter, Clara, far away. She thought of the love she had once poured into her family, the sacrifices she had made, and the hope that had driven her hands through decades of winter nights. A quiet wish formed in her heart, that Clara would one day understand the depth of her devotion, the silent message carried in every stitch, and the ripple of kindness that had reached across an entire town. In the following weeks, the town of Maplewood continued to awaken. Inspired by Eleanor's example, community members organized drives for the less fortunate, started mentorship programs for children, and created informal networks of support that bridged generational and social gaps. The warmth she had nurtured was no longer confined to sweaters, it had become a philosophy, a town-wide ethos that shaped interactions, decisions, and priorities. Even as winter receded and spring approached, Eleanor's presence remained central. She still knitted, still delivered, still offered quiet wisdom to anyone willing to listen. But now, she saw the impact reflected in the town itself, a community more compassionate, connected, and aware of the power of small, intentional acts. The sweaters had been the spark, but the flame now burned brightly in the hearts of everyone who called Maplewood home. And in the stillness of her cottage, Eleanor realized that her journey was far from over. She had begun with a simple act of love, and in doing so, had transformed not only her life but the lives of countless others. Maplewood had awakened, hearts had softened, and the town had embraced a lesson that would endure far beyond a single winter, that love expressed through action, however small, could create a legacy of warmth, hope, and enduring human connection. Eleanor smiled quietly, her fingers resuming their rhythm on the knitting needles. The world outside was changing, one act of kindness at a time, and she knew that the threads she wove, literal and figurative, would continue to bind the hearts of Maplewood together for generations to come. The first signs of spring had begun to appear in Maplewood, snow melting along the streets, crocuses peeking through the thawing earth, and the soft scent of pine and damp soil mingling in the early morning air. For Eleanor Parker, the change of season carried with it a quiet expectation, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the rhythm of life, new beginnings always seemed to accompany the first buds of spring, or perhaps, deep in her heart, she felt the approaching resolution of a story begun long ago. And then, one chilly afternoon, it happened. The familiar sound of crunching snow under tires reached her ears, followed by the gentle tapping of shoes against her porch steps. Eleanor, who rarely left the warmth of her cottage for such mundane events, felt an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation. She opened the door, and there she stood, Clara, her daughter, grown into a woman of quiet strength, with eyes that mirrored Eleanor's own in their depth and resilience. For a moment, neither spoke. Time seemed to suspend itself, holding its breath in the crisp air. Memories flooded Eleanor's mind, the small hands she had once held, the soft giggles echoing through the cottage, the lullabies she had sung through long winter nights. And yet, there was also the ache of absence, the years of separation that had felt impossibly long, and the unspoken words that had lingered in both their hearts. Finally, Eleanor whispered, voice trembling yet full of love, "Clara, you're here." Clara stepped forward, eyes glistening with tears. "I had to come back, Mom," she said softly, the weight of years and distance carried in every word. "I didn't know how to find my way back, but I saw what you did for this town. I saw the warmth you gave to everyone here, and I knew I had to see you." Eleanor drew her daughter into a gentle embrace, holding her tightly as if to make up for all the lost years. "I never stopped thinking about you," she murmured, voice muffled against Clara's shoulder. "Every stitch I've knitted, every sweater I've delivered, has carried a piece of love meant for you, and for anyone who needed it." Tears ran freely down both their faces as they stood on the porch, the wind whistling softly around them but unable to pierce the cocoon of love and relief surrounding them. Clara's hands clutched her mother's arms, feeling the textures of the life Eleanor had lived in her absence, the calluses on her fingers from knitting, the warmth of her embrace, and the resilience that had grown quietly but undeniably in the years apart. They stepped inside the cottage, and Eleanor led her daughter to the fire. The room smelled faintly of lavender and yarn, familiar and comforting. Sweaters, scarves, and mittens were stacked neatly on tables and chairs, each one a testament to Eleanor's decades of devotion. Clara's eyes swept over the scene, a mixture of awe and understanding washing over her. "I had no idea," Clara whispered. "All this, you did this alone?" Eleanor shook her head gently. "Not alone," she said. "I had hope, and I had love. And now, I have you back. That's what matters most." Clara knelt beside a basket of colorful yarn, fingers tracing the textures as she asked, "Tell me everything. Tell me why you never stopped knitting, why you never gave up on anyone." Eleanor's eyes softened, reflecting the depth of experience, pain, and triumph. "When your father passed, and then when life pulled you away, I realized that love doesn't vanish. It evolves. It can be expressed in ways beyond words, through care, through action, through small gestures that build bridges over loneliness and grief. Every sweater I made, every stitch I knit, was a way to carry love forward, to make sure someone felt seen, valued, and safe. And it has worked. The town, the children, even you, love has a way of returning to us, often when we least expect it." Clara listened, tears streaming, and for the first time in years, felt the weight of separation lift. She realized that her mother's quiet heroism had not only nurtured the town but had preserved a love strong enough to guide her back home. Over the next few days, mother and daughter walked together through Maplewood, witnessing firsthand the impact Eleanor's devotion had created. Families who had received sweaters waved, children hugged Clara instinctively, and neighbors approached to share stories of warmth and hope. It was a living testament to Eleanor's philosophy, that love expressed through action, even anonymously, could transform a community. Clara joined her mother in knitting, her hands awkward at first, but guided gently by Eleanor's experience. Together, they prepared new sweaters for the upcoming winter, their conversations filled with laughter, stories, and the rebuilding of a bond that time had stretched but could not break. One afternoon, while delivering sweaters to a nearby family, Clara asked, "Mom, do you ever feel lonely still? Even with all this love around you?" Eleanor smiled wistfully. "Sometimes. But loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. And now, with you here, with the town awakened, and with the lives we touch, loneliness feels less like a burden and more like a memory. Love fills the gaps, Clara. Love always does." The emotional resonance of their reunion reached the town as well. Maplewood residents, aware now of Eleanor's story, welcomed Clara with warmth, recognizing her as part of the legacy that had transformed the community. Together, mother and daughter became a symbol of reconciliation, love, and the enduring power of human connection. One evening, seated by the fire, Clara whispered, "I don't know how to thank you for never giving up on me, for never giving up on all of us." Eleanor took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't need to thank me. Just carry it forward. Love, kindness, empathy, those are the real gifts. And one day, you'll see how far one person's quiet devotion can reach." As night fell over Maplewood, the mother and daughter sat together, knitting, talking, and sharing memories long held in their hearts. Outside, the town was alive with small acts of generosity, laughter, and hope. Inside, Eleanor and Clara had woven together years of longing, grief, and love, transforming absence into presence, and loss into profound connection. By the time the fire dwindled to glowing embers, both Eleanor and Clara felt a sense of peace neither had known in years. The threads of their relationship, once frayed by time and circumstance, had been rewoven stronger than ever. And in the quiet rhythm of their needles, in the gentle warmth of the cottage, the story of mother and daughter, of a town awakened, and of love expressed through quiet action reached a poignant, cathartic crescendo. Maplewood had witnessed the ripple effect of Eleanor's devotion, but for Eleanor and Clara, the true miracle was personal, intimate, and transformative, the reunion of hearts, the restoration of trust, and the realization that love, persistent, patient, and quietly heroic, could endure across years, distance, and the coldest of winters. The small town of Maplewood had never seen such unity in its streets. News about Margaret's quiet sacrifice had spread beyond the town, reaching neighboring communities, local newspapers, and even social media posts that carried pictures of children holding up her hand-knitted sweaters. Some people drove hours just to be a part of what was about to happen that evening. The church on Main Street, with its tall steeple and weathered white paint, became the gathering place. Its steps were decorated with flowers, photographs of children wearing Margaret sweaters, and handwritten notes that read things like, "Thank you for keeping us warm," and "You loved us without even knowing us." As the sun dipped low, a golden glow cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The townspeople, bundled in coats and scarves, began lighting candles one by one. Children held them carefully in paper cups, their breath visible in the cold night air. The flames flickered against their innocent faces, symbolizing the warmth Margaret had given to so many winters. Inside her modest home, just a block away, Margaret sat by the window. Her daughter, Anne, insisted she stay in bed because her health was weakening. But Margaret, wrapped in a shawl, leaned forward and pressed her hand against the glass. From her chair, she could see the glow of dozens of candles forming a river of light along the street. Her weary eyes welled up with tears. "Mom," Anne whispered, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "they're all here for you." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, darling. They're here for love. I was only the thread, love was the fabric." Outside, Pastor William stepped to the church steps, holding a candle of his own. His voice carried through the chilly air as he addressed the crowd. "Tonight, we gather not just to thank a woman who quietly gave from her heart, but to remind ourselves what happens when kindness becomes a way of life." Margaret knitted warmth, but more than that, she knitted a town together. She gave us a lesson we can't afford to forget, that small, unseen acts of love can change the world. The crowd bowed their heads. Parents held their children closer. Elderly neighbors clasped gloved hands. Even teenagers, often distracted by their phones, stood solemnly, some recording but most simply soaking in the emotion of the moment. And then, the vigil took on a life of its own. People began stepping forward, one by one, to share stories. A young mother, voice trembling, said, "2 winters ago, I didn't have enough money for a proper coat for my little boy. Margaret's sweater arrived on our doorstep, and he wore it every single day. It wasn't just the sweater, it was the feeling that someone cared about us when we felt forgotten." An older man added, "My grandson is grown now, but he still keeps the sweater Mrs. Margaret gave him when he was 5. It's patched and frayed, but he won't throw it away. He says it reminds him that kindness is real." Each testimony layered emotion upon emotion, until the entire gathering felt less like a vigil and more like a living tapestry of gratitude. Tears rolled freely. Even strangers held hands in the candlelight, realizing that Margaret's simple act had touched them all in some way, directly or indirectly. Inside her home, Margaret listened as and kept the window slightly cracked open, so her mother could hear the words of love and appreciation carried on the winter air. Every sentence pierced her heart with both joy and humility. She had never expected thanks, never wanted recognition, but hearing the stories made her feel the years of aching fingers, sleepless nights, and countless stitches were worth it 1,000 times over. At one point, little Emily, the same child who once gifted Margaret a flower years ago, stepped to the microphone. Her small voice rang out across the crowd, "Mrs. Margaret gave me my favorite sweater. I wear it every night because it makes me feel safe. She makes me believe in angels, and I think maybe she is one." The entire crowd gasped softly, some nodding, others sobbing quietly. Even Pastor Williams wiped a tear. Margaret pressed the shawl against her face, weeping silently. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking. The vigil ended with the townspeople lifting their candles high, a sea of golden light piercing the cold darkness of winter. Together, they sang a simple hymn about love and hope, their voices rising into the frosty night sky. For that moment, Maplewood was transformed, not by wealth, not by grand gestures, but by the ripple of one woman's quiet devotion. When the last notes faded and the candles slowly burned low, people left sweaters, scarves, and balls of yarn at Margaret's doorstep, a symbolic offering to continue her legacy. Some promised to start knitting groups. Others pledged to volunteer at shelters. The spirit of her work had ignited something larger than she could ever have imagined. And closed the window and knelt by her mother. "Did you hear them, Mom? Did you hear what you've done?" Margaret's voice was faint but steady. "I heard, and I know now. I wasn't knitting sweaters. I was knitting hearts together." And kissed her mother's hand, her tears falling freely. That night, as Maplewood fell quiet and the candles finally dimmed, the town carried with it a renewed sense of purpose. Every family, every child, every soul present had been marked by the extraordinary example of an ordinary grandmother. The vigil became a story that would be retold for years, how one woman's gentle act sparked a flame of kindness that no winter's chill could ever extinguish. The story now moves into its most heart-wrenching yet uplifting chapter. Grandma Eleanor, now fragile and in her final winter, senses that her time is drawing near. Despite her declining health, she insists on knitting one last set of sweaters. The scene is deeply cinematic, her frail hands tremble, but her determination burns bright. Her daughter and granddaughter gently protest, urging her to rest, but Eleanor softly replies, "This is my promise. Until the very end." The emotional stakes rise dramatically as the audience realizes this will be her last winter of giving. As Christmas approaches, the townspeople notice Eleanor hasn't been as visible in the community. Rumors spread, "She's too weak this year, maybe she won't make it through the season." Yet, on Christmas Eve, something extraordinary happens. Every doorstep in the town wakes up to find a neatly wrapped sweater, hand-knitted with Eleanor's signature pattern of warmth and care. The mystery baffles everyone. How did she manage it, given her condition? The truth is revealed in a heartfelt sequence. Eleanor had secretly taught her daughter, her granddaughter, and even a few neighbors how to knit her special style. Together, in the evenings, they worked quietly, honoring her legacy and ensuring that no one in town would feel forgotten. The scene plays like a small-town American miracle, a collective act of love sparked by one woman's selflessness. Eleanor passes away peacefully that night, wrapped in her own final creation, a sweater she made for herself, stitched with the same love she gave others. Her daughter and granddaughter hold her hands, whispering gratitude through tears. The loss is painful, but it is softened by the beauty of what she left behind. The funeral scene is both sorrowful and deeply unifying. Nearly the entire town gathers, wearing the sweaters Eleanor had made over the years. From children to elderly neighbors, the church is a sea of colors and patterns, each sweater carrying a personal story. One man stands and shares, "When I was at my lowest, Eleanor gave me this sweater, and it reminded me I wasn't alone." Another says, "This kept me warm when I had nothing else." Dozens of similar stories ripple through the crowd. The climax reaches its emotional peak as the camera, in a cinematic sense, pans across the congregation, every face marked with tears, every person carrying a tangible reminder of Eleanor's love. The sweaters are no longer just fabric, they are a legacy of compassion, proof that small acts of kindness ripple across time and hearts. The section closes with a sense of closure and hope. The granddaughter, inspired and matured, vows to continue her grandmother's tradition, not just through knitting but through a life lived in service and kindness. The moral lesson shines clearly: one life, lived with love and selflessness, can ignite a community to carry forward goodness long after the person is gone. The story enters its final, reflective stage, a gentle epilogue that lingers like a warm afterglow. Time has passed since Eleanor's departure, yet her presence remains woven into the very fabric of the town. The first scene paints a peaceful picture: winter has returned, snowflakes drift lazily through the air, and children laugh as they play outside, all bundled in sweaters that carry the unmistakable style of Eleanor's knitting. The granddaughter, now a young woman, walks through the town square with quiet dignity. She carries a small basket of yarn, her grandmother's old knitting needles tucked inside. As she moves, townsfolk greet her warmly, not with pity for her loss, but with respect for the torch she now carries. The camera of the mind lingers on her hands as she begins to knit, her motions mirroring Eleanor's, steady and graceful. Each loop and pull feels like a continuation of something sacred. Over the years, the act of gifting sweaters at Christmas evolves into a town-wide tradition. Families gather every December to knit together, creating garments not just for themselves but for anyone in need, homeless shelters, hospitals, nearby struggling towns. What began as one woman's humble act becomes a movement of collective kindness. Even those who never met Eleanor speak her name with reverence. Children grow up hearing stories of the lady who knit love into every stitch. The granddaughter becomes the central figure of this movement, teaching new generations how to knit the special Eleanor pattern. One touching moment unfolds when she helps a small boy, clumsy with the needles, finally master his first scarf. He beams with pride, saying, "Now I can give this to someone who needs it, just like Miss Eleanor did." It is in moments like these that Eleanor's spirit feels alive again, subtly present in every act of kindness. The narrative widens its lens to show the broader transformation of the town. Once an ordinary small American town, it has now become known for its unity and generosity. Visitors arrive during the holiday season, not just to see the lights or the decorations, but to witness the sweater tradition. Local news stations occasionally cover the story, portraying it as a modern tale of compassion in a world often divided. The most powerful image of the epilogue is the annual Christmas Eve gathering. Every year, the townspeople come together in the church where Eleanor's funeral was once held. Instead of mourning, they now celebrate life and warmth. The pews are filled with people wearing sweaters, bright, colorful, patched, or newly knit, all carrying the legacy of one woman's hands. Together, they share stories, light candles, and place baskets of sweaters at the altar, ready to be distributed wherever warmth is needed most. The granddaughter stands at the front, holding her grandmother's original needles. In a hushed, emotional moment, she addresses the crowd. "My grandmother believed no one should ever feel forgotten, especially in the coldest nights of winter. Today, we remember her not by our tears, but by keeping her promise alive. Every stitch we make is a prayer of love, every sweater a shield of kindness. This town remembers, because she taught us how to love." The epilogue closes with a deeply cinematic shot, the church doors opening, townsfolk stepping into the snowy night, each carrying sweaters to deliver. Their laughter and chatter fill the cold air, glowing lanterns lighting their path. The camera pans upward to the night sky, where stars glimmer like a blanket above the earth, a cosmic echo of Eleanor's gift of warmth. The final lines offer the moral in soft, reflective prose. Eleanor may have left the world, but her love became a tradition, her kindness a legacy, and her memory a fire that will never go out. The town will always remember, not just through stories, but through action. And somewhere, in the hush of winter's silence, it feels as though Eleanor is still watching, smiling, proud, and forever present in the love she left behind.